this is the overview of this particular presentation. I'm going to explain what those titles mean in a second. So what's in a name? So do you remember in the very first presentation slide I mentioned how atheism and agnosticism are merged sometimes together, right? And there's an advantageous gain in doing that. We're going to look at those advantageous gains in this presentation. The second thing that I want to look at is that within atheism, so there are different kinds of people with different mentalities, and they've tried to take the direction of atheism in different ways. This is what we'll be looking at. And finally, I will also be looking at something called political groupings, how atheists, some of their political positions also have an impact in how Islam and Muslims are viewed. Okay, so if you guys, if you guys remember from the very first class, from the very first presentation, that merging agnosticism with atheism is advantageous because then it makes the neutral position atheism, which is problematic. If you allow this to take place, what it means is that even children, infants, unborn kids, are atheists. And this was a point made by this guy here, George Smith, in this book called Atheism, the Case Against God. He writes, "The man who is unacquainted with theism is an atheist because he does not believe in a God." So this is somebody who would be agnostic, but he claims it as an atheist. This category will also include children with conceptual capacity to grasp the issues involved, but who is still unaware of those issues. So like I said, even babies, infants, can be declared atheists under that merging of atheism and agnosticism. Why is this important? Because it has implications in policy. It has implications in education, right? Have you guys heard of something called the problem of demarcation? Hands up if you've heard of this before. No one? So the problem of demarcation is a well-known problem in the philosophy of science, right? So when is something science and when is something non-scientific or pseudoscience, right? And depending on where you draw the line, it has implications which kind of programs and activities get funds for science, have educational status, etc., etc. These definitions, though they may seem very trivial right now, they do have these major social political implications. So I think it's very clear to make sure that these definitions are very well considered. Right, now here's another one, right? There's another thing that atheists claim, and they say stuff like, well hang on, you're an atheist as well. You reject all these other gods by every other religion, so you're an atheist, right? So this is a very interesting claim that I found out about when I was reading into this literature. So this is Hitchens. He says, Richard Dawkins may have phrased it most pungently when he argued that everybody is an atheist, in saying that there's a God from Ra to Shiva in which he does not believe in. All that the serious and the objective atheist does is to take the next step and to say there's just one more God to disbelieve in. So what he's just trying to say here is that, let's say we're all Muslims, right? So we reject the God of Christianity, Judaism, etc., etc., etc. So we are atheists. Then the atheist will tell you, just take one more step and you're on the same page as me. That's a kind of a rhetorical game that we play, right? I'll unpack these, I'll sort of systematize these for you, but just showing you what implications come out. So, on this very point, right, atheists claim that if you're an atheist, you should reject every religion, okay? However, we need to be careful in that if you reject a particular religion, it does not necessarily mean that you are an atheist as their understanding, okay? There's a difference between local atheism, these are my own terms that I've come up in my paper, which I can share with you inshallah. Local atheism is when you reject a particular religion. For example, I presented the argument for Islam, this particular king evaluated it and he rejected it. He didn't think it was comfortable enough for him. So he is now a Muslim atheist. He rejects the Islamic faith. Does that make sense? To go from there and to claim that I reject all religions is a false move, because that means you have evaluated every single religion out there. Does that make sense? Global atheists and local atheists. So when they're saying that you are an atheist as well, be careful in that you can still be a local atheist in that you reject certain religions, but you can still be a theist yourself. Does that make sense? Everyone okay with that, yeah? So again, small rhetorical games that they play, but I thought that was just an important thing to sort of pinpoint. Right, here's an interesting one. I think this is going to shock a lot of you, right? So, do you remember I told you about one move that they do is positive atheists and negative atheists? And pretty much negative atheists are simply agnostics, right? So, in the Oxford Handbook of Atheism, which was recently published, I think, in 2012, there was like a global survey done about atheists across various countries. Interestingly enough, the book says you couldn't assess from Muslim countries because of various restrictions, right? So, anyways, now here's the interesting point. If you put and you lump together atheism and agnosticism together, these are the kind of weird characterizations that come out of this. I told you before that negative atheists for me are particularly just agnostics, nothing else. However, look what happens when you put them together. So these are Australia, United States, and United Kingdom. These are positive atheists, so what we strictly define as people who deny the existence of God. Negative atheists who are uncertain about God's existence. Now when you lump them together, that is the figure you get. So there's a jump in numbers about 50%. That is a massive jump. Look at the United States, 61.7%. From 7,000 to 18,000 in number. And look at the United Kingdom, so 6,000 as positive atheists, 53% jump. Right? So it allows atheists to occupy a group territory that is larger than they actually are. Which again, plays to their advantage. It's a numbers game. It's a numbers game, right? So, now why do they do this? So this is a paper, I've just literally written down the abstract here. So this paper, the name of this paper is Atheists and Other Cultural Outsiders, Moral Boundaries and the Non-Religious in the United States. So this is a particular paper that analyzes their condition in the States, right? And I just wanted to share this to sort of give you an idea of why we would possibly utilize these things. We used data from a nationally represented survey to analyze anti-atheist sentiment in the United States in 2014, replicating analysis from a decade earlier and extending them to consider the factors that foster negative sentiment toward other non-religious persons. So what is it that fosters people distrusting atheists or people who don't conform to religion? We find that the anti-atheist sentiment is strong, persistent, and driven in part by moral concerns about atheists, and in part by agreement with cultural values that affirm religiosity as a constitutive moral grounding of citizenship and national identity. So, what the paper tries to demonstrate is that a lot of theists have problems trusting atheists because because of morality and other issues related to national citizenship, etc. And for that reason, atheism is considered as a very unpopular minority in the States. And you can find this in many surveys. So it is in their advantageous gain to open up the bracket of atheism, to allow agnostics to come under their fold and increase their numbers so that they gain social and political currency. Do you see my point? This is a possible motivation. I'm not saying that this is what they actually do. They could be doing it for alternative reasons or for reasons I may not have assessed, but this is a possible motivation in their narrative. Right.
Just on those numbers there.
Sure.
Was this like a survey that was
Yeah, it's in the Oxford Handbook of Atheism.
So like, do people even know the difference between an atheist and like...
Yeah, so read the book, read the book and you'll see what I mean, right? So I criticize, so the paper I have, this is the one that's published in Cambridge University Press. I'll send you this paper where I criticize the book for this very reason, that you're conflating two different categories under one and just amplifying atheism unnecessarily. Not that this is a problem, but you're mischaracterizing agnostics by putting them with atheists. That's the problem.
Right.
So yeah, it's I know it seems like it's like a game of semantics, but it has huge implications. This is what I'm telling you. Since 2004, what has atheism done to sort of gain or change its direction or evolve its direction in terms of advancement? And there are three distinctive trends that have come out. Three distinctive trends. The first one, some people claim, which we'll look at, we will unpack this shortly. Some people claim that even the very term atheism, we need to remove it. Atheism is a very negative and sticky term. It has a lot of negative connotations, so we need to remove it altogether, okay? That's one trend. The second trend is that we need to make atheism more than just the idea that we don't agree with God's existence. We need to make it about social justice, morality, politics. We need to make it a bigger movement than what it is. The third trend is atheism should cooperate with religion, in that it should take the best parts of religion, absorb them, and come up with its own social structure. So these are the three different trends that I've been able to distinguish. Let's look at them one by one, right? In 2007, Sam Harris was invited to a big conference of Atheist Alliance, right? And in this conference, he had a speech. He said the speech is called "The Problem with Atheism," right? And he mentioned some interesting points on why atheists themselves shouldn't adopt that title. Let's analyze those comments. He says, "I think that atheist is a term we do not need, in the same way we don't need a word for someone who rejects astrology. Astrology is, you look at the stars and zodiac and horoscopes, etc. We simply do not call people non-astrologers, right? All we need are words like reason, evidence, common sense, and that word there, right? To put astrologers in their place, and so it could be with religion. Well, rather than declare ourselves atheists in opposition to all religion, I think we should do nothing more than advocate reason and intellectual honesty." So what is he trying to do here? If you assess the language, for him, atheism is just another synonym for reason, in contrast to blind faith, which is religion, right? Atheism is about evidence, whereas religion has zero evidence. Do you see these semantic links that he's making? So he goes on to say that, so let me make my somewhat seditious proposal explicit. We should not call ourselves atheists. We should not call ourselves secularists. We should not call ourselves humanists or secular humanists or blah, 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 whatever. We should not call ourselves anything. We should go under the radar for the rest of our lives, and while there, we should be decent, responsible people who destroy bad ideas wherever we find them. So he thinks it's a very bad thing that we've adopted this term atheism. But all we're doing is we're using common sense to sort of point religion and correcting them. So his proposal is, let's eliminate the word altogether. This is one reason that he points out. The second thing that he says, right? He says that another reason why we should eliminate atheism is because atheism itself has negative connotations which we don't need, because it is already preloaded with a lot of suppositions. This is what he says. Another problem with calling ourselves atheists is that every religious person thinks he has a knockdown argument against atheism. We've all heard these arguments, and we're going to keep hearing them as long as we insist upon calling ourselves atheists. Arguments like, atheists can't prove that God doesn't exist. Atheists are claiming to know there's no God, and this is the most arrogant claim of all. And he says we have Brussels teapot and thousands of dead gods, and now a flying spaghetti monster, the non-existence of which also cannot be proven. And yet, belief in these things is acknowledged to be ridiculous by everyone. The problem is that we have to keep having the same argument over and over again, and the argument is being generated to a significant degree, if not entirely, over our use of the term atheism. So just to provide you with some context, right? So you know how basically that there's no concept of the flying spaghetti monster. Atheists have made this into a god as like a joke because we don't have proof for God's existence. We don't have proof for the existence of the flying spaghetti monster, so let's make a church. So there's not a church in the US of the flying spaghetti monster, right? So what he's just trying to say is that we keep associating ourselves with these very bad arguments which theists seem to provide because we're calling ourselves atheists. Let's just get rid of this term altogether. Are you guys following the narrative? Yeah? So one more point that he says, that another thing that we keep getting attacked on as atheists is this argument. So too with the greatest crimes of the 20th century. How many times are we going to have to counter the charge that Stalin, Hitler, and Pol Pot represent the end game of atheism? So just to clarify this point, in this past century, a lot of the wars have been done in the name of secularism, not religion, right? Stalin, Hitler, etc., right? Mao even as well. And the criticism that is levied against atheism is that, hang on, these people weren't religious, they were atheists, but they also killed in the name of, of their worldview. So you can't just point the guns on religion and then safeguard yourself. But he says, hang on, this is just a stupid argument that we're just getting because of our association with atheism. So unless we eliminate this term, we will always then be attached with Stalin and Hitler. Do you get my point? Right? So his narrative is, get rid of the term. And of course, that is problematic for various reasons, right? People have criticized, and atheists have criticized Harris, in that we need a term, we need one label to at least unite all the people who have these beliefs. Otherwise, we'll just be a scattered group, okay? And it will make atheists into an immobile or sterile community. So we cannot just let go of these terms, right? Everyone okay with the first way of atheism is evolving? Let's look at the second one, right? Make atheism about social justice, right? So I found this quite interesting. So there was a group within atheism called Atheism Plus. And you see this logo at the bottom here? That's their symbol. And this movement was started off by a feminist atheist blogger. Her name was Jen McWright, right? And she had two motivations, from what I can tell, in creating this movement known as Atheism Plus. The first was that within atheism, there were issues of sexism and racism. So Harris has been criticized because he uses very aggressive language towards religious believers, particularly Muslims. So he's been, labeled as a racist. Dawkins made a few statements that people attacked him on, and because they were sort of sexist, right? So that was one motivation in making atheism about more than just disbelieving in God. Let's make it about social issues as well. And the second motivation is because if we're going to be attacking religion because of its existence of God, let's also attack religion by providing an alternative framework that deals with the questions of morality, politics in a very healthy way. So this was the origination of Atheism Plus, right? Atheism Plus social justice, etc., etc. And that's what the name stands for, right? And this is what Jen mentions as the waves of atheism. So she identifies, you remember there's waves of feminism, wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, right? So I think she probably took the terms from there. So she identifies that the first wave of atheism were like the ivory tower academics, right? People who were philosophers and academics, discussing about the non-existence of God. The second wave of atheism were these new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, who pretty much publicly attack all religions. Now we need a third wave of atheism, which is about caring about how religion affects everyone and applying skepticism to everything, including social issues like sexism, racism, politics, etc., etc. So we want to make atheism more than just denying God. We want to make it into a social movement. We need that. Now, there are other examples of people who are trying to fall into this similar trajectory. In the States, one of the biggest national atheist parties, right? They changed their name from National Atheist Party to the Secular Party of America. Because if you change from atheism to secularism, you inculcate broader values, a bigger umbrella term, right? So you know how, remember the LGBT movement coming out, etc.? So also by linking themselves to LGBT, they also adopt the identity politics of the marginal victim, right? So they also try to increase their social political currency by being very closely associated with the LGBT community as well. So you see that in some of these works. Another interesting thing is, do you guys remember the ex-Muslim atheists that I posted a while ago? Ali Rizvi and then Armin Nabavi. So those two, they have a weekly podcast. Now it's very interesting, they don't call themselves atheists. They call themselves secular jihadis. Why secular jihadis? I mean, I really question that. And it's because they want to appeal to a wider audience. This is what they say on their podcast. Secular Jihadis is a podcast with Ali Rizvi and Armin Nabavi, two ex-Muslims trying to spread atheism, secularism, and enlightenment values in the Islamic world. So I find the names quite interesting. They reveal a lot from how atheism is evolving, right? Again, I'm not saying these are definitive, I'm saying these are interesting cues, right? So given this, Atheism Plus and various other ways that people have tried to make atheism more than just a belief about God, they have been criticized First of all, atheists have criticized atheism plus because they think it's just another feminist attack on atheism, which we don't really need. Some people say that this is a divisive narrative. Why do we need to spread our resources thing? We're already quite scattered across the world, so we don't need another atheism plus. Let's just make it just atheism. Some disagree with the premise. There is no link between atheism and racism or sexism. Atheism is singly just the proposition that there is no God or lack of belief in God. Nothing else. Don't link it with social justice. So that's point 3 and 4, right? Now, people have countered these criticisms. So one guy, his name is P.Z. Myers. He's not so well known as an atheist, but he is a prominent activist. So he says, precisely because atheism, refuses to incorporate any position on human values at all, if we don't make any commitment at all to any progressive ideas, we are only going to descend into chaos and purposelessness. So he's basically saying that if atheism doesn't really try to incorporate things like socialism or social issues, morality, etc., it means that as a group we don't really have any definitive purpose. Like, how do they move from here? So this is a conversation blocker, is what he's saying. Again, interesting observations. So we saw from the first part, Harris said, let's get rid of atheism. In this part, we're saying make atheism a bigger umbrella. So at least what this is indicating, that within the movement of atheism, there seems to be some kind of disagreement in how to move forward. Right? Here's a really interesting one. I found this guy very interesting. So Alain de Botton, I don't know how you say his name, but there you go. He came up with this idea called Atheism 2.0, which I found so fascinating, right? And this is his thesis. He wrote a book called Religion for Atheists. He says that the secular world is full of holes. We have secularized badly, I would argue. And a thorough study of religion could give us all sorts of insights into areas of life that are not going too well. So his thesis is, okay, we reject God, no problem. We don't need to agree with God. But let's take the useful components of religion and adopt them under atheism. So you know how we have passage of rights, you know, when a boy becomes a man, therefore he has to pray, etc. We could do something similar, ritual ceremonies for atheists. We could have places of worship or non-worship for atheists, right? So they wanted to open up $1 million church of atheism in England, and Dawkins was quite critical of it because he thought, what are you doing? You're just, you're wasting our resources, basically, right? And basically he calls for that. This allows people to have a communal belonging. So we can remove God, but still need to fill in the gaps which secularism doesn't provide, which is the idea of community and social connectivity. Now, again, this movement has also been criticized because, according to most atheists, it dilutes the message of atheism. And most importantly, it seems to make religion look good, which is not what they want to do, right? If you're saying we need to borrow things from religion, that is the antithesis of aggressive atheist stance against religions across the world. And again, point number 2, it's an unnecessary way of dividing the atheist movement and waste of resources. So, from these 3 observations, you can see that how atheism is supposed to move forward is still no clarity on how it's going. Now, let's look at political groupings, right? By this I mean how particular individuals line themselves up on the political spectrum for their narratives, right? Now, let's look at Ayaan Hirsi Ali. So you guys remember, she's one of the biggest ex-Muslim atheists, right? She has changed her narrative in the past few years. So she wrote 4 books. In the first few books, she was very aggressive against Islam. Eliminate it, kill it, etc., right? In her more recent book, Heretic, she doesn't argue that we should eliminate it. What we should now be seeking to do is try and change Islam from inside. So, and what she means by this is, for example, that you know how we believe the Quran is the word of God? Let's just change that it is a word of man rather than the word of God. You know how we believe that the Prophet ﷺ is infallible? The Prophet is fallible. So these small changes, but they have huge theological implications. So she's trying to reform Islam that can be suitable under a secular framework, right? In her new book. And what's very interesting is that Hirsi Ali, she also is very close with neoconservatives, right? You know what neocons are, right? Like the left and the right, etc. So the neoconservatives are interesting because they, of course, there's a wide group of this, but they are very pro-democracy, have very interesting foreign policy, at least with regards to Muslims, right? And they have a very Christian root in their ideology, right? So Hersey, in her relationship with neocons, she works with this institute here, American Enterprise Institute. She even relayed this idea that, hang on, maybe it might be difficult for Muslims to become full-on atheists. It may be difficult for them to do that. So maybe what we can do is we can make Christianity more appealing for Muslims, so they can leave on to another religion, but one that is less problematic, which works with the neoconservative paradigm. Right? So I found that very interesting as an observation. Right? Sam Harris, let's look at what he has to say. So both Sam Harris and Hirsi Ali, actually a common theme, as you can probably see, Islam is the biggest geopolitical threat for atheism. Right? So during one of my readings of these books, I found out that Sam Harris, when he was asked, which one would you... Remember, Sam Harris is a scientist through and through. Like, he will do anything to preserve science, right? So look at his claim. So when somebody asked him, who would you rather choose as a president, Noam Chomsky or Ben Carson? So for those of you who don't know who these people are, Noam Chomsky is a big guy. He's a political commentator, he's a linguist by profession, right? He's an atheist, doesn't believe in God, but very well respected, and believes in the progressive nature of science. Ben Carson is a Christian conservative, and he is also anti-scientific on some ends, even a climate change denier, right? So somebody asked him once, who would you rather choose to be president? And this is what Harris responded. Harris said that he would choose Ben Carson, right? Why? Because he says, at the very least, Carson understands that jihadis are the enemy. So, remember, he shares a lot of commonalities with Chomsky. Chomsky is an atheist. He supports science. But on the issue of who he would choose as president, he would choose Carson. Why? Because he hates jihadis as much as the next person. So it just shows how deep-rooted that prejudice against Muslim Islam is in his narrative, right? So the same book that I quote this from, it mentions, since the events of 9/11, 45 people have died in 9 jihadist attacks in the US, while between 2014 and 2015, approximately 26,000 died due to gun-related violence. So the US, they have very weak gun control, as you know. Around 13,000 people a year. Harris recognizes that Carson is dangerously deluded, but from his comment it seems that there's one point on which he has sympathy for Carson. The issue of jihad, right? The issue against Muslims. It's very interesting that even above science, Harris will choose Carson as a person who would never actually work with it in terms of worldview, right? Sam Harris, I'm sure you've heard of Douglas Murray, right? He's an interesting British guy, right? So he's also neocon, and Sam Harris also works with him, right? And him and Murray actually attacked the left for being too soft, and they actually attacked them that they're Islamist sympathizers, right? So even on the political spectrum, you can see how atheism and neoconservatism sort of feed into each other for very interesting intersections, overlaps in this Islamophobic narrative that exists out there. In fact, he said, even at Trump's inauguration, I found this quite interesting, he said that when liberals insist that only fascists defend borders, then voters will hire fascists to do the jobs that liberals won't do. Very interesting conversation. Also, and I'm sure you guys ever heard of Majid Nawaz? Yep, public enemy to So Majid Nawaz has an institution called Pulliam Foundation, right? It's funded by secularists, all sorts. Guess who one of his biggest funders are? Sam Harris, right? And what I find is such an ajib relationship. They came together to write a book on Islam. And what is the agenda of this book? To reform Islam, similar to what Hersey is doing, right? So, so you can read the book. I found the book to be a little bit senseless, stupid at some points. But basically, we have an atheist who rejects God, but he tries to cater an argument for how much can we sort of bend Islam to make it more acceptable in a secular setting. And Majid Nawaz tries to, of course, with his secular framework, tries to do that. So collectively, what I'm just trying to show you here is, one, the name, the semantics game is very important, right? If atheism is brought on to include a lot of things, it has social and political consequences, educational, etc. Two, we saw that amongst atheists, there is still no clear consensus on what is the direction forward right now. And this is important for us to know because it means that when we do things on the ground, we can utilize it to our advantage a little bit. Three, there is an interesting overlap between atheism and the political Islamophobic narrative that seems to be coming out of Yukon narratives. And I think it's very vital that we understand these relationships so that at least when tackling Islamophobia, we can understand how atheism fits part of that bigger narrative.